Hello, and welcome to English 278 Modern African American Literature here at Delta College. My name is Joseph Lewis, and I will be your instructor for this course. So, the reason why I'm creating this video today is to orient you to the course management site and also to orient you to our first major literary period, which is the Harlem Renaissance that we'll be covering over this course of the semester. So when you go to the course e-learning site, you'll notice that I try to keep things very simple, very straightforward. And so the major tabs that you'll be using for this site will be the content section in e-learning along with the discussion board post. So all of your readings will be in the content section on e-learning, and then you'll be responding to what you've read in the discussion board posts, and you'll be responding to each other. Hopefully we'll have some great conversations around the course reading materials. I'll also update the news slash announcements page on a weekly basis, talking about the next literary period that we will be going over throughout the week. And so that information, and then sometimes I'll also include links on that page that supplement the information that you'll be reading about in the content section on e-learning. So pretty much for this course, you need to make sure that you review the news, on the announcements page, make sure that you are reviewing the content section along with participating, I should say, in the discussion board post. So, the first major literary movement that we are going to encounter this semester is the Harlem Renaissance. Now, a lot of times, most of the information that I'm getting from your class comes from the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. And so what the Norton Anthology of African American Literature does is that it's broken up into two volumes, and that first volume places the Harlem Renaissance pre modern period, and it begins modern African American literature with the actual when we talk about the modernism, realism, naturalism period. But when I teach this class, I include the Harlem Renaissance with the modern period because more largely in American literature, we sort of saw what's happening is sort of like this modernist movement of literature. And so what's happening during this moment, and the same thing that we see happening in the Harlem Renaissance, is that we see authors writing for like art for art's sake. They're writing for aesthetic values. What they're not doing is that they're not sort of dealing with sense and sensibility, and they're not necessarily dealing with, what's right and what's wrong, and chivalry and romanticism. But during this period, during the modernist period, not only do we see this happening in the Harlem Renaissance, but we also see this happening in a more larger sort of American literary scale, is that it's more about art for art's sake. It's more about the essence of the poem. It's more about the essence of the literature. It's more about, again, like I said before, the aesthetic quality. So another characteristic that's happening during this time period is that authors are trying to make things new. In a more larger American literary context, a lot of American literary writers are trying to self-identify or sort of separate themselves from this, like, their sort of British influences, and trying to come up with this sort of like true, like, sort of American art form of literature. And so we sort of see that happening in terms of the Harlem Renaissance as well. We see writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay trying to understand what Alain Locke talks about as this new Negro. So this new Negro at this time during the late 1800s, early 1900s is emerging, and we sort of see this is the first generation out of slavery. This is the first generation post, like, Reconstruction. And so what's happening here is that we have this new generation emerging post slavery, and we also have that they're going to discuss in your book the first Great Migration. And so in the first Great Migration, we have a lot of African Americans from the South populating cities in the North, such as Chicago, such as Manhattan, particularly in Harlem, such as Detroit. We have area, St. Louis, Missouri. So the Harlem Renaissance is not just particular to the Harlem Renaissance, but it defines more the sort of larger sort of artistic movement that's going on in African American literature, which is bolstered by a lot of the great migration tendencies of African Americans coming from the South and moving to the North. And so, a lot of, like I said before, a lot of the literature during this time period is dealing with not only art for art's sake, but it's also dealing with this idea of what the new Negro is. How do we define Black cultural expression? How do we define Black cultural expression within this age of modernism? What defines Black art? How should Black language, or what is Black language? And if there is a Black language, how do we use that? How should it be used? Should it be used, to establish a sense of morality and ethics, or again, should it be used for art's sake? So one of the major arguments that you'll see going on during this time that you'll read about is this sort of exchange that happens between Langston Hughes and George Samuel Schuyler. And so we'll talk about that in the discussion board post. So, when you think about what Langston Hughes is saying and you think about what George Samuel Schuyler is saying, you have to read it for yourself, you'll see sort of like some of the tensions that emerge during this time. And so that's why I like to put the Harlem Renaissance within the context of the modernist era, because more largely we sort of see this happening in American literature. Just to give you a much larger context of what we're embarking on in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, is that the Harlem Renaissance also comes from this out of this time where we have a lot of writings that are coming out of abolition. And so we have a lot of people like Frederick Douglass who are writing about, the abolition of the Negro. We also have, during the mid 1800s, we also have, the emergence of, even from the late 1700s up through the mid 1800s, we have the emergence of the slave narrative. So a lot of, the slave narratives during the early 1800s dealt with this idea of recapturing their experience of what it's like to be a slave. A lot of times, sometimes the slave narratives were written by the actual person who experienced this. Sometimes they were dictated. But, this became part of the literary tradition for African Americans or Black Americans coming over from Africa to the US. Another thing that we also see happening during this time period is that we see fictional works during this time period that are during the mid 1800s that are really entrenched in this idea of what to do with the Negro. What happens, how do we sort of understand the Negro in captivity? And then when we are, during the Reconstruction era, now what happens, what is it like for the life of a Negro post-slavery? We all, during this time, we see lynchings go up. We see more and more sort of racial acts of violence enacted on Black bodies, ironically, after slavery. So a lot of the literature during that time, one of the major books is Frank Webb's The Garys and Their Friends. They really deal with, what's going on in society and also sort of how the African American fits within this society, tense with sort of racial tensions that are going on more largely in the country. So the Harlem Renaissance is coming out of this time of, what to do with the newly freed Negro. And so this generation that's coming out of this time, this generation is coming from, this generation is coming after, Booker T. Washington. This generation is coming after Anna Julia Cooper. This is a generation that is concerned with the social conditions of the Negro, but they're more concerned with the aesthetic qualities and how do we define these aesthetic qualities. And this is not only going on in the US, but this movement of how do we sort of understand the new Negro? How do we understand like the more global sort of like black in Western countries such as Great Britain, such as France. We also see this what's happening in France called the Negritude movement. And so in the Negritude movement, we also see this sort of like understanding or trying to get this understanding of what defines, what makes black art. And so I'll have a link on the Negritude movement in the announcements page so that you can make some cultural connections between what's happening in France and what's happening in the US. So when you think about the Harlem Renaissance, so let's pull back for a second. When you think about the Harlem Renaissance, think about this idea of what defines black art, what defines black literature, what defines black poetry. Is it something that's indicative in black culture? Or is it a social circumstance? So if you were to put any culture in this particular circumstance, they would produce this particular type of art. And so these are some of the discussions that are going on in this time period. We also see one of the things that we see going on in particularly around African American literature that we don't see that we see particularly with African American literature, I should say, is this establishment and assertion of the woman's voice as well. So artists, like I said before, writers like Anna Julia Cooper, prior to the Harlem Renaissance, were also writing about, the woman's role in fighting for, justice for Black people during the Reconstruction era. And so we see this, or we see these sort of fictional depictions happening in the works like Zora Neale Hurston. So you'll read that from Zora Neale. You'll read about this idea of the woman's work in labor and sort of like literary, like sort of the symbols that she's getting at in terms of the woman's body, and how that fits within this like sort of larger context. You'll be reading poetry from Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. And like I said before, I want us to sort of chop it up about this, this argument that Langston Hughes and George Samuel Schuyler are having during this time period. And then the book will also talk about Alain Locke and how Alain Locke is very influential in sort of generating this idea of the new Negro and sort of how that goes into our perceptions and conceptualizations of the Harlem Renaissance. So go through the section in e-learning that discusses the Harlem Renaissance, and a lot of this information will be discussed. Just one second, my computer froze. And we'll have this conversation about the Harlem Renaissance on the discussion board post. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, do not hesitate to ask. I will upload a discussion board in the discussion board section on e-learning just for questions. If you don't want to upload a question on the discussion board post in e-learning, you can send me an email and I can deal with your question there. So I will contact you again next week, but in the meantime, happy reading, happy writing on the Harlem Renaissance, and I will see you in cyberspace.